in the mid-14th century. A legend circulated across the known world. It was said that a young woman could carry a basket of pure gold from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea without ever being harmed. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was the safest, most efficient logistical machine the world had ever seen, a unified superhighway of commerce that flattened the earth. But the historians often forget a brutal truth about logistics. The same road that carries silk carries the biological weapon. The same efficiency that moves gold moves death. We are taught to fear war, but war isolates. War burns bridges. War stops movement. It was peace that built the trap. It was the perfect connectivity of the 1300s that allowed a microscopic passenger to hitch a ride on the trade winds and slaughter 200 million people. This is not just a story about a disease. This is the autopsy of the first globalized world. Welcome to the historian's desk. If you believe history is the greatest story ever told, help us tell it. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more deep dives, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin. To understand the magnitude of the catastrophe that is about to unfold, you first have to understand the sheer engineering brilliance of the victim. We often think of the Middle Ages as a time of darkness, isolation, and mud. But by the mid-1300s, the world was actually experiencing its first era of hyper-globalization. The architect of this new world was the Mongol Empire. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered distance. They built the medieval equivalent of the internet. A physical World Wide Web that connected the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. It was called the YAM. Think of the YAM not as a postal service, but as a military-grade logistical backbone. It consisted of over 10,000 relay stations, spaced roughly 20 to 30 miles apart, exactly the distance a horse could gallop before exhausting itself. At each station, fresh horses were waiting, saddled and ready. A rider arriving with a message or a package didn't stop to sleep. He didn't even stop to eat. He simply vaulted from a sweating, dying horse onto a fresh one and kept riding. This system allowed information and cargo to travel at speeds that were physically impossible for any other civilization. A message could travel 200 miles in a single day. It was the zero latency of the 14th century, and riding on top of this high-speed network was the greatest accumulation of wealth in human history. The Silk Road wasn't a dusty path. It was a conveyor belt of luxury. Spices from India, silk from China, furs from Siberia, slaves from Russia. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Caffa grew fat on this trade. They were the tech giants of their day, the hubs where the network terminated and the profit was realized. Merchants believed they had tamed the world. They believed that by securing the roads, wiping out the bandits, and streamlining the tolls, they had eliminated risk. But nature has a very dark sense of humour. The Mongol engineers had solved the problem of geography. They had bridged the gaps between civilizations. But in doing so, they had dismantled the world's natural firewalls for thousands of years. The vast, empty distances of the Central Asian steppes acted as a quarantine zone. If a virus or a bacteria emerged in a remote village, it usually burned itself out right there. It couldn't travel fast enough to find a new host. The latency of the old world was its safety mechanism, but the YAM changed the math. Now, a traveller could cross the infection zone and reach a populated city before we even showed the first symptom. More importantly, the speed of the YAM allowed something else to survive the journey. Imagine a bale of marmot furs wrapped tightly in burlap, strapped to the back of a courier's saddle. Deep inside that fur, hiding in the warmth, is a flea. Normally, the flea would starve or die of exposure on a slow, months-long caravan trek, but moving at the speed of the Mongol relay, the flea survives. It arrives in the next city hungry. It arrives alive. The merchants in Caffa looked at the approaching caravans and saw profit. They saw gold. They saw the triumph of civilization. They didn't realize that the yam hadn't just accelerated trade, it had accelerated evolution. The superhighway was open, the tolls were paid, and the first shipment of the apocalypse had just arrived at the station. To find the villain of our story, we must leave the bustling relay stations of the yam and head north. We must go to the edge of the world, to the vast, windswept grasslands of the Central Asian steppe, modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Mongolia, for centuries. This landscape was a biological silo. It was a natural prison for one of the oldest and deadliest organisms on Earth, the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Now, understand this. Nature is usually a system of checks and balances in these grasslands. The bacteria had a natural host, the Tarbagan marmot. A large, social ground squirrel, about the size of a cat, for millennia, the marmot, the flea, and the bacteria existed in a cold, evolutionary standoff. The bacteria lived in the marmot's blood. The flea drank the blood. The marmot died, but not too many of them, and not too fast. It was a closed loop, a local ecosystem of death that stayed trapped in the grass. But in the 1330s, two things happened that broke the seal on the silo. One was ecological, one was economic. First, the climate turned against us. The weather patterns in Central Asia began to shift. A precursor to the Little Ice Age, droughts dried up the grasslands. The marmots, desperate for food, began to migrate closer to human settlements. They broke their own quarantine. But the second factor, the human factor, is where the irony lies. Remember the Pax Mongolica, the perfect peace. That peace had created a booming global economy, and in the fashion capitals of Europe and China, there was a sudden, insatiable demand for furs. Soft gold, they called it. The Tarbagan marmot has a beautiful, thick pelt. Suddenly, hunting marmots wasn't just about local survival anymore. It was an industry. It was a way to get rich. And this greed committed a fatal tactical error. It ignored the old wisdom. You see, the local nomadic hunters, the people who had lived on the steppe for generations, had strict cultural taboos. They were unwritten survival manuals. They knew that if you saw a marmot wandering alone, stumbling, or acting sluggish, you do not touch it. You leave it alone. They didn't know what bacteria was, but they understood the pattern. A slow marmot is a cursed marmot, but the Pax Mongolica brought outsiders. It brought commercial hunters, traders, and opportunists who didn't know the folklore. They didn't care about the taboo. They only cared about the quota. When they saw a sluggish marmot that didn't run away, they didn't see a biological weapon. They saw an easy catch. They saw free money. Let's reconstruct the patient zero moment. It likely happened in a hunter's camp near Lake Sicily, in modern Kyrgyzstan. A hunter skins a sick marmot. He is focused on the pelt, ensuring the knife doesn't nick the valuable fur. He doesn't notice the tiny, black specks jumping off the cooling body of the animal, the flea, specifically Xenopsilla chaopes, or its steppe cousin. Now, we need to pause and look at the engineering of this tiny assassin. Because Yersinia pestis is not just a germ, it is a master of bioengineering. When the bacteria enters the flea, it doesn't just float around, it colonizes the flea's foregut. It multiplies rapidly, creating a thick biofilm plug that completely blocks the flea's throat. This is the blocked gut mechanism. It is diabolical. The flea becomes starving. It is ravenous. It jumps onto a host, in this case, our hunter, and bites. It tries to drink blood. But it can't swallow. The bacterial plug is blocking the way. So, in a frenzy of starvation, the flea vomits. It regurgitates the blood back into the wound, mixed with chunks of the bacterial plug. It is a biological pump. The flea thinks it is eating, but it is actually injecting. It bites again, and again, and again, desperate to feed. It becomes a machine gun of infection. The hunter doesn't feel much, just an itch. He bundles the furs, including the infected ones, onto his cart. He joins the caravan heading west. He is happy. He has a good haul. He enters the stream of the yam system. Within days, he develops a fever. Large black swellings, buboes, appear in his groin and armpits. He dies on the road, but his death is irrelevant. The cargo survives. The fleas, hiding in the warmth of the fur bales, are waiting for the next host. This is the moment the perfect peace turned into a suicide pact. If this were a time of war, that caravan would have been stopped at a border. It would have been raided. It would have been delayed. The fleas would have died of starvation in the middle of nowhere. But because of the Mongol efficiency, because the roads were paved and the passes were clear, the contagion moved faster than the incubation period. The caravan reached the city of Sarai on the Volga River, then Astrakhan, then Tana, and finally, it reached the glittering jewel of the Black Sea, the Genoese trading colony of Caffa. By 1345, the infection had reached the gates of Europe, but it didn't knock. It laid siege. The Golden Horde, the Western army of the Mongols, had surrounded the city of Caffa. But there was something wrong with the Mongol army. They weren't just fighting the Genoese defenders. They were fighting an invisible enemy within their own ranks. Soldiers were collapsing in their tents. The greatest army on earth, the disciplined descendants of Genghis Khan, was melting away. Panic began to set in. The Mongol commander, Janibeg, looked at the high walls of Caffa. He knew he couldn't take the city with swords. His men were too weak to hold them. But Janibeg was a pragmatist, and he was spiteful. If he couldn't have the city, no one would. He looked at the piles of corpses accumulating in his camp, and he had an idea that would change the definition of warfare forever. He ordered his engineers to wheel the trebuchets, the massive siege engines designed to crush stone walls, closer to the front lines. He didn't load them with rocks. He didn't load them with fire. He loaded them with the dead. Inside the walls of Caffa, the Genoese merchants watched with horror as the sky darkened. They thought they were safe behind their fortifications. They didn't realize that the enemy had just weaponized the very air they breathed. The first body crashed into the streets of Caffa, then another, then another. The siege was technically over. But the war, the real war, was just beginning. The date is October, 1347. The sound you hear is not the clash of steel, it is the wet, heavy thud of a decomposing body hitting the cobblestones inside the walls of Caffa. The Genoese defenders looked up in horror. They had prepared for arrows, they had prepared for fire, but they had not prepared for this. The Mongol trebuchets were functioning as a rudimentary, yet terrifyingly effective. artillery system. But the payload wasn't kinetic. It was biological. Eyewitness accounts from the time, specifically the memoirs of Gabriele de Mussi, described the scene as a descent into madness. Mountains of dead, he wrote, were thrown into the city. The smell alone was enough to make strong men vomit. The Genoese tried to dump the bodies into the sea. They tried to burn them, but the math was against them. The Mongols had more bodies than the Genoese had shovels. But here is where the medical misunderstanding of the Middle Ages became fatal. The people of Caffa believed the disease was spreading through the miasma, the foul air coming from the rotting corpses. They covered their mouths. They burned incense. They were looking up at the sky, terrified of the smell. They should have been looking down, because while the humans were panicked by the bodies, the rats of Caffa were delighted. The corpses were a feast. The local rat population mingled with the new arrivals, the rats that had been flung over the walls or scurried through drainage pipes from the Mongol camp. The fleas jumped ship. Xenocilla Cheopes found new hosts within days. The symptoms appeared inside the city, the fever, the vomiting of blood, the black boils. The containment was breached. Caffa was no longer a fortress. It was a petri dish. Now, let's look at the Genoese. These were not soft men. They were the roughest, most pragmatic capitalists of the 14th century. They were corporate mercenaries. When they realized the city was lost, they didn't just think about survival, they thought about inventory. This is the most damning detail of the story. As the panic set in, the Genoese captains ordered the evacuation, but they didn't just load people, they loaded the cargo. Caffa was the terminus of the Silk Road. The warehouses were bursting with spices, silks, gold, and gems worth millions in today's currency. Leaving it behind was unthinkable. Imagine the scene at the docks. Men coughing up blood, stumbling under the weight of heavy crates. Officers shouting orders, prioritizing expensive silk over dying refugees. They pack the holds of 12 great galleys tight. They pack the food. They pack the water. They pack the gold. And inevitably, they pack the rats. These 12 ships cut their ropes. They rowed furiously, breaking through the Mongol blockade as the coastline of Crimea faded into the mist. The sailors probably felt a surge of relief. They had escaped hell. They were heading home to Italy. They were rich. They were alive. But they were wrong. They weren't refugees escaping a war zone. They were intercontinental ballistic missiles, and their guidance system was set for the heart of Europe. The journey from Crimea to Sicily is roughly 1,500 miles. It takes a few weeks by galley. That voyage is one of the most horrifying ghost stories in maritime history. Day by day, the crew began to drop. The close quarters of a medieval ship are a perfect incubator. Men sleeping shoulder to shoulder on the rowing benches. No ventilation. Rats running over their feet while they slept. The discipline on board collapsed. The dead were thrown overboard, leaving a trail of floating corpses across the Black Sea and the Aegean. By the time the coast of Sicily appeared on the horizon, there were barely enough men left standing to steer the rudders. October 1347. The port of Messina, Sicily. The dockworkers look out and see 12 strange galleys drifting into the harbour. The sails are tattered, the rowing is erratic, the ships look derelict. Curious, the locals row out to meet them. They climb aboard to offer help, or perhaps to claim salvage rights on the abandoned cargo. What they found on those decks would haunt them for the rest of their short lives. Sickness clinging to their very bones, as one chronicler put it. Sailors covered in black oozing boils, delirious, dying among piles of gold and rotting silk. The authorities in Messina realized the danger quickly. They ordered the ships to leave. They ordered a quarantine, but it was too late. The transaction was already complete. The rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas had already jumped onto the clothes of the curious fishermen. The Trojan Horse had been opened. The Genoese thought they were bringing wealth back to the west. Instead, they had brought the bill. The debt of the Pax Mongolica had come due, and Europe was about to pay in blood. Messina fell within days. Then the ships moved on, looking for other ports: Genoa, Venice, Marseille, like a chain of dominoes. The great cities of the Mediterranean opened their arms to their own destruction. The golden age of trade was over. The age of the grave had begun. By early 1348, the biological payload had been delivered. The ships from Caffa had docked in Sicily, Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. The rats had disembarked, and now the Pax Mongolica logic applied to the European mainland. The very things that made Europe rich, its trade routes, its river networks, its crowded market squares, became the transmission vectors. But the real catastrophe wasn't in the countryside. Not yet. The catastrophe was in the cities. We look at medieval cities today with a sense of romance. We see the stone walls, the narrow winding streets, the towering cathedrals. But from a tactical perspective, a medieval city in 1348 was a death trap. It was a kill box. Take Florence or Venice. These were the New Yorks and Shanghais of their day. They were densely packed. Real estate was expensive inside the safety of the walls, so people built up. Tenement buildings blocked out the sun. Narrow alleys were filled with the waste of 100,000 people. The population density was staggering, and crucially, there was no way out. The Great Walls of Florence were a masterpiece of military engineering. They were designed to withstand a siege from a human army. They were designed to stop cavalry, but against a microscopic enemy. Those walls did the opposite of what they were intended to do. They didn't keep the enemy out. They locked the victims in. When the plague hit, the authorities did what any government would do. They locked the gates. They declared a quarantine. In doing so, they turned their thriving metropolises into sealed incubators. We don't have to guess what happened next. We have the reports from the ground. Giovanni Boccaccio, a writer in Florence, documented the collapse of society with the precision of a war correspondent. He describes a scene of total systemic failure. The speed of the kill was terrifying. Boccaccio wrote, "Men and women dined with their families in the morning and supped with their ancestors in the world to come that evening. The incubation period seemed to vanish. The latency was gone." And because the death rate was so high, up to 60% in these urban centres, the infrastructure of civilization simply stopped working. There were no grave diggers left. There were no priests to perform last rites. There were no police to stop the looting. In Venice, the canals, the arteries of commerce, became open sewers of infection. Gondoliers refused to row. The bodies piled up on the docks, unburied, waiting for the tide that never came. In Avignon, the Pope was so overwhelmed by the body count that he consecrated the Rhone River itself. He made the water holy ground, so they could just throw the corpses directly into the river. Think about that image. The river that once carried trade was now a conveyor belt of the dead, flowing out to sea. But the physical horror pales in comparison to the psychological break. This is where the cost of connection becomes truly personal. Humans are social animals. Our survival strategy has always been. stick together. When we're scared, we hold our children. We gather in churches. We care for the sick. The Black Death weaponized our humanity against us. Doctors died because they treated patients. Priests died because they heard confessions. Mothers died because they held their feverish children. So, the survivors did the unthinkable. They stopped connecting. Boccaccio tells us that fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they did not belong to them. The social contract was torn up. It was every man for himself. The perfect peace had dissolved into perfect chaos. As the cities turned into graveyards, the people looked up. They looked to the one institution that was supposed to have the answers, the one power greater than the kings, greater than the merchants, greater than the walls. They looked to the church. They prayed for salvation. They whipped themselves in the streets to beg for forgiveness. But the sky remained silent, and as the bishops and cardinals began to die alongside the peasants, a terrifying realization began to spread across Europe. If God's representatives were dying, then who was flying the plane? The spiritual foundation of the Western world was about to crack, and when men lose their fear of God, they start looking for devils among themselves. To understand the psychological impact of 1348, you have to realize that the medieval church wasn't just a place you went on Sundays. It was the government, it was the media, it was the science, it was the absolute, unquestionable framework of reality. The church held the monopoly on truth. The narrative was simple. If you are good, God protects you. If you sin, you are punished. It was a transactional relationship. You paid your tithes, you confessed your sins, and in return, the church guaranteed your spiritual, and often physical, safety. But in 1348 that contract was breached. The Black Death didn't just kill the sinners, it didn't just kill the poor, it tore through the monasteries and convents with terrifying ferocity. In fact, the clergy died at a higher rate than the general population. Why? Because they were the frontline workers. They were the ones giving last rites. They were the ones breathing in the dying breaths of the infected. In Montpellier, out of 140 Dominican friars, only 7 survived. In Avignon, 60% of the agonizing deaths were priests. For the common peasant, watching their local priest turn black and die in agony was a theological earthquake. It posed a terrifying question. If God is killing his own soldiers, then who is left to defend us? And where was the commander-in-chief during this war? Where was the Pope? At this time, the papacy wasn't in Rome, it was in Avignon, France, a massive fortified palace of wealth and power. Pope Clement VI was a man of science and intellect. He saw the apocalypse unfolding, and he realized that prayer wasn't working. So, he turned to the best doctors of the day. Their advice was bizarre, yet strangely effective based on the miasma theory. They told him to isolate himself, to purify the air. So, picture this image. It is one of the most striking visuals of the Middle Ages. The Vicar of Christ, the most powerful man on earth, locked alone in his chamber deep inside the palace. He's sitting on his throne, day and night, specifically placed between 2 massive, roaring fires, even in the heat of summer. The fires were kept burning to cleanse the atmosphere. The heat must have been unbearable, the smoke stifling. He sat there for weeks, sweating, isolated, terrified. He forbade anyone to come near him. He managed the affairs of the collapsing world through a crack in the door. The irony is palpable. The shepherd had abandoned the flock to save his own skin. He survived. Yes, the heat likely kept the fleas away. But the authority of the church did not survive those fires. When the people realized that their leaders were hiding, the chain of command broke. A power vacuum opened up, and into that vacuum stepped the radicals. If the establishment couldn't stop the plague, the people would do it themselves. Enter the flagellants. These were not priests. They were a grassroots movement, a spiritual militia. They believed that the church had become too soft, too corrupt. They believed that the only way to force God to stop the killing was through blood, their own blood. They formed massive processions, marching from town to town. Imagine the sound before you see them. The low, rhythmic chanting of hymns, the heavy thud of feet, the crack of leather. They wore white hoods. They carried heavy scourges, whips with multiple tails, knotted with iron spikes. They would gather in the town square, stripped to the waist, and beat themselves until their backs were raw meat. They whipped themselves for 33 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life. Blood splattered onto the onlookers, and the onlookers, they cheered. They wept. They caught the blood on rags and treated it like holy relics. The flagellants became rock stars of the apocalypse. They had more authority than the Pope. When they marched into a city, they took over. They read their own letters from heaven. They granted their own absolutions. It was spiritual anarchy. The Pope, sitting between his fires, looked at this movement and saw a threat bigger than the plague. He saw a rival government. He eventually declared them heretics and ordered them crushed. But the damage was done. The illusion of a unified, divinely ordered world was shattered. The Black Death had proven that the institutions of man, whether the great walls of the city or the great prayers of the church, were powerless against nature. The people were terrified. They were grieving. And they were angry. And anger, when it has nowhere to go, seeks a target. They couldn't kill the virus. They couldn't kill the rats. They couldn't kill the Pope. So, they looked for a scapegoat closer to home. They looked for someone different. Someone who, in their paranoid delirium, they could blame for poisoning the wells. The perfect peace was dead. The god had failed. Now, the massacre would begin. When a society faces a threat it cannot defeat, and a god it cannot appease, it does something terrifying. It triggers a psychological immune response. It stops looking for a cure and starts looking for a culprit. The logic of the mob is brutal, but it is coherent. They reasoned. If the air isn't poisoning us, and if God isn't punishing us, then someone must be doing this to us. They needed a tangible enemy, someone they could touch, hit, and burn. They needed a scapegoat. The conspiracy theory that emerged in 1348 was the medieval equivalent of fake news, but with lethal consequences. The rumour started in southern France and spread along the same trade routes as the virus. The theory was simple. The Jews were poisoning the wells. Why the Jews? Partly, it was ancient hatred. But there was a tactical observation involved, one that tragically backfired. Jewish communities often had strict hygiene laws dictated by their scripture. They washed their hands before eating, they buried their dead quickly, they isolated their sick. As a result, in some areas, Jews were dying at slightly lower rates than Christians. To the paranoid medieval mind, this wasn't hygiene, this was proof of guilt. Why are they living while we are dying? The mob decided it was a conspiracy to wipe out Christendom. But if you look closer, under the layer of religious hysteria, you find the cold, hard steel of economics. In many German cities, the Jews were the primary moneylenders, the kings, the bishops, and the merchant guilds owed them massive amounts of money. The plague provided a convenient opportunity. If you kill the creditor, the debt dies with him. This brings us to the darkest day of the entire pandemic, Strasbourg, February 14th, 1349, St. Valentine's Day. Strasbourg was a major commercial hub on the Rhine. The plague hadn't even fully hit the city yet. The panic was preemptive. The city council, the wealthy elite who actually understood the law, tried to protect the Jewish population. They knew the poisoned well theory was garbage. They tried to maintain order, but the guilds, the butchers, the tanners, the working-class backbone of the city, revolted. They stormed the council chambers. They overthrew the government. This was a coup d'etat driven by fear and greed. The new government gave the order immediately: liquidate the Jews. They didn't just run through the streets killing randomly. This was organized. It was industrial. They took the entire Jewish population of Strasbourg, 2,000 men, women, and children. They marched them to the Jewish cemetery outside the city walls. There, the carpenters had been busy. They had built a massive wooden platform, a house of timber designed for one purpose. They herded the people onto the platform. Then, they gave them a choice that reveals the utter hypocrisy of the moment. Convert to Christianity, and you can live. Some did. They were pulled off the platform in terror. Mothers pushed their small children out, begging for them to be baptized just to save their lives. But for the vast majority, the answer was silence. The fire was lit. It was one of the largest massacres of Jews in the Middle Ages. As the flames rose, the mob didn't just watch, they went to work. They went straight to the Jewish quarter. They broke into the houses. They didn't look for poison. They looked for the ledgers. They looked for the loan documents. They burned the books. The irony is devastating. The massacre was successful. The debts were erased. The guilds were richer. But biology doesn't care about your bank account, and it doesn't care about your scapegoats. A few months later, the plague arrived in Strasbourg in full force. It killed the butchers. It killed the tanners. It killed the men who lit the fire. The poisoned wells theory was proven wrong by the piles of Christian corpses. But the virus wasn't done. It had consumed the Mediterranean. It had broken the Holy Roman Empire. Now it looked north. It looked across the narrow channel of water that separated the chaotic continent from the green, sheep-filled island of England. The English thought they were safe. They thought the ocean was a moat. But remember, the Pax Mongolica built ships too. And a ship had just docked in the port of Weymouth. The Black Death was about to end the Middle Ages in England, not with a treaty, but with a silent invasion that would destroy the very soil of the feudal system. June 1348. Stand on the cliffs of Dover, look south, and all you see is the grey, churning water of the English Channel. For centuries, this strip of water was England's greatest defence. It was a moat dug by nature itself. While Europe burned, while the fires of the Jewish massacres lit up the Rhineland, the English sat in their green fields, feeling invincible. They believed in splendid isolation. But isolation is an illusion in a global economy. England wasn't an island fortress. It was a resource colony. It produced the wool that clothed Italy. It drank the wine produced in France. It was connected. And that connection arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis, in Dorset. It wasn't a warship. It was a simple merchant vessel from Gascony, carrying fine Bordeaux wine. On board was a sailor who felt a little tired, a little feverish. He stepped onto the dock to secure a rope. That single footstep was the equivalent of an amphibious invasion. The spread was mathematically precise. It moved north and east at a rate of 1 mile per day. It didn't rush. It marched. It reached Bristol, then Gloucester, then Oxford, and finally, inevitably, it reached the filth and squalor of London. But to understand why the English death was different, you have to look at the operating system of the country. It was called feudalism. Think of feudalism not as a social structure, but as a rigid corporate pyramid. At the top, the king and the lords, the CEO and the board. At the bottom, the serfs, the workforce. The system relied on one crucial economic variable: cheap labour. There were millions of peasants. They were easily replaceable. They were tied to the land, legally forbidden to leave. They were, for all intents and purposes, biological machinery owned by the estate. The lord provided protection, and the serf provided calorie output. It was a stable system. It had worked for 400 years. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it broke the machine. By 1349, nearly 50% of the English population was dead. Let that number sink in. Imagine a factory where half the workers disappear overnight. Imagine an army where half the soldiers vanish. The result was the Great Silence of 1349. This is the most haunting imagery of the English countryside. Chroniclers described entire villages where the doors swung open in the wind, and the only inhabitants were the wolves. But the most terrifying sight was the fields. It was harvest time. The wheat was golden. The heavy ears of corn were bending the stalks. It was a bumper crop. Nature was bountiful. But there was no one to cut it. The crops rotted in the fields. The cattle and sheep, with no one to fence them or herd them, wandered aimlessly into the corn, growing fat and wild. Nature was reclaiming the civilization, and this is where the plot twist happens for the surviving lords. This was an apocalypse. Their income depended on the harvest. No harvest means no taxes. No taxes means bankruptcy. But for the surviving serf, this was leverage. For the first time in history, the peasant realized his value. He looked at the lord and said, "You need me more than I need you." The supply of labour had crashed. The demand remained high. Basic economics dictates that the price must rise. The peasants began to demand wages, real wages. They demanded better food. They demanded the right to leave. And if the lord refused, the peasant simply walked away to the next estate, where a desperate rival lord would pay him double. The elite panicked. They realized the hierarchy was dissolving. The king, Edward III, tried to legislate against the laws of economics. He passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351. It was a desperate, hilarious piece of tyranny. It legally froze wages at pre-plague levels. It made it a crime to refuse work. It tried to force the genie back into the bottle. But you cannot legislate against a shortage. The law failed. The black market for labour exploded. The feudal system, which had survived wars and famines, was being dismantled by a bacteria. However, before the new order could rise, the old order had to suffer one last humiliation. We've talked about the lords, but what about the experts? What about the men of science? As the death toll mounted, the people of England and all of Europe turned to the intellectual elite, the doctors, the physicians, the professors of Oxford and Paris. Fix this, the world screamed. Tell us what is happening. And the experts answered. They put on their robes, they consulted their star charts, they opened their ancient books, and they came up with a cure. a cure so absurd, so dangerous, and so tragically confident that it proved that in the face of the unknown, these smartest men in the room are often the most dangerous. Prepare yourself. We're about to enter the operating room of the Middle Ages. In times of crisis, we are programmed to look for the man in the white coat. We trust the establishment. We trust the science. In 1348, the CDC of the medieval world was the medical faculty of the University of Paris. These were the smartest men in Europe. They had read Aristotle. They had memorized Galen. The King of France asked them for an official report. He wanted the truth. And in October 1348 they delivered their findings. It was a document of breathtaking arrogance. They didn't blame the rats. They didn't blame the fleas. They didn't blame the ships. They blamed the stars specifically. They concluded that a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius had corrupted the atmosphere. It sounds ridiculous to us, but to them, this was big data. It was a mathematical explanation for a biological problem. And because the diagnosis was wrong, the prescription was deadly. The doctors believed the disease was in the air, the miasma, but once the bad air entered the body, it had to be removed. This is where the tragedy of medieval medicine turns into a horror movie. The doctors didn't cure patients. They tortured them to death. The standard procedure was bloodletting. The logic was internal plumbing. The blood is boiling with poison. We must drain it to cool the system down. So, they opened the veins of patients who were already weak, dehydrated, and fighting a massive infection. They drained their immune system right into a bowl. It was medical malpractice on an industrial scale, if that didn't work. They moved to lancing. They would take a knife and slice open the buboes, the hard, black swellings in the groin and neck. They would squeeze out the pus, then sear the open wound with a red-hot iron to cauterize the poison. Most patients didn't die of the plague. They died of septic shock and pain on the operating table. And of course, there was a premium tier of healthcare for the rich. If you were a wealthy merchant or a noble, the doctors offered you theriac. This was the ultimate snake oil, a fermented mixture of opium, snake flesh, and herbs, aged for years. Or, if you were truly elite, they prescribed potable gold. They ground up emeralds and pearls, mixed them with gold dust, and made you drink it. The logic: gold is pure, so it will purify the body. The reality: the sharp shards of crushed gems shredded the stomach lining, causing internal bleeding. The rich paid a fortune to be poisoned faster than the poor. But the enduring image of this era isn't the patient, it's the doctor himself. As the plague returned in waves over the following years, the medical community realized they needed protection. They invented the first hazmat suit in history, and it is the stuff of nightmares. Picture the silhouette standing in your doorway, a long wax-coated leather coat, designed to make fluids and fleas slide off, gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and the mask, that terrifying bird-like beak. It looks like a demon, but it was actually a gas mask. The beak was 6 inches long for a reason. It was a filter. It was packed with theriac straw, spices, camphor, and dried flowers. The doctor breathed through this filter to scrub the miasma from the air before it hit his lungs. The glass eye holes protected him from the evil gaze of the patient, and in his hand he carried a wooden cane, not to walk with, but to examine the patient without touching them, to lift the sheets, to point, to push away the dying who tried to grab his coat. The plague doctor became the angel of death, When you saw that beak, you knew it was over. He wasn't there to save you. He was there to record your name in his book and to collect his fee from your heirs. By 1350, the verdict was in. The experts had failed. The science was a fraud. The prayers were empty. The system had collapsed completely. And when humanity realizes that no one is coming to save them, something shifts in the collective psyche. The fear burns out, and it is replaced by a strange, nihilistic party. If we're all going to die anyway, why are we working? Why are we obeying the laws? Why don't we dance? The cemeteries are full, but the dance floor is just opening. There is a strange phenomenon in combat psychology. When soldiers are pinned down under heavy fire for too long, when they realize that survival is statistically impossible, the fear often vanishes. It is replaced by a strange, manic euphoria, a fatalistic freedom. In 1350, Europe entered this state of mind. The establishment, the church, the state, the medical faculty had all collapsed. The social contract was void. So, the survivors decided to rewrite the rules. If the plague was going to kill the saint just as quickly as the sinner, then what was the point of being a saint? Giovanni Boccaccio describes this shift with shocking clarity. He tells us that the citizens of Florence stopped locking their doors. They walked into the abandoned mansions of the dead rich, drank their vintage wines, wore their velvet clothes, and slept in their four-poster beds. It was the biggest squatter movement in history. Taverns stayed open 24 hours a day. Gambling, drinking, and public sexuality became the new normal. But this wasn't joy, let's be clear. This was nihilism. It was a desperate, angry party on the edge of the grave. They were drinking to drown out the sound of the death carts rolling past the window. And from this psychological breakdown, a new art form was born. It appeared on the walls of churches, in cemeteries, and in manuscripts across Europe. It was called the danse macabre, the dance of death. Before the plague, art was religious. It was about glory, heaven, and angels. Now, the art became brutal. The motif was always the same, a line of dancing figures. But look closely at the dancers. At the front is a pope, then an emperor, then a king, then a merchant, then a peasant, and leading them all, holding them by the hand, are grinning skeletons. This wasn't just horror. This was political satire. For the peasant looking at this painting on a church wall, the message was radical. It said, "Look at your lord, look at your bishop. He's no better than you. He rots just like you. The worms don't care about his title." Death had become the great equalizer. The plague stripped away the mystique of the ruling class. You cannot claim to be chosen by God when you are vomiting blood in the gutter next to your servant. This new attitude spilled over into fashion. Before 1348, Europe had strict sumptuary laws. These were laws that dictated what you could wear based on your income and class. Peasants wore wool, lords wore silk. It was a visual caste system. But after the plague, the laws were ignored. The survivors inherited the wardrobes of the dead. Suddenly, you had farm labourers working in the fields wearing the silk tunics of dead merchants. You had milkmaids wearing gold necklaces found in empty houses. The visual hierarchy of feudalism was looking like a masquerade ball. The priests complained. They preached against this vanity. But no one was listening anymore. The fear of hell had been replaced by the reality of earth. And the reality was, life is short, nasty, and brutish. So you might as well look good while you live it. But parties eventually end. The wine runs out. By 1351, the worst of the dying was over. The great mortality finally burned itself out. The survivors woke up with a massive hangover. They looked around at a silent continent. Roughly 50% of the population was gone. 200 million people across Eurasia. But as the smoke cleared, the survivors noticed something strange. The fields were still there, the gold was still there, the cows were still there. The wealth of the world hadn't vanished. It had just been redistributed. There was the same amount of money, but half as many pockets. The survivors didn't realize it yet, but they had just won the lottery. The Black Death had destroyed the world. Yes, but for the men and women left standing, it was about to create a golden age. The most ironic economic boom in history is about to begin. Historians often call the 14th century the calamitous century. But if you look at the tax records from 1355, a few years after the plague, you see something that looks impossible. You see a golden age. This is the great paradox of the Black Death. It was a biological tragedy, yes, but economically, it was the greatest wealth transfer in human history. And it didn't go from the poor to the rich. For the first and only time, it went from the rich to the poor. The math is brutal but simple. The supply of humans had been cut in half. The supply of land, gold, and livestock remained constant. Suddenly, the peasant was a scarce commodity. In England, wages doubled. In Italy, they tripled. A labourer could earn in 3 days what used to take him 3 weeks. We can see this shift in the archaeological record. We see it in the trash pits. Before 1348, a peasant's diet was bread, vegetable stew, and water. After 1350, the trash pits are full of pig bones, cow bones, and beer kegs. The survivors weren't just eating to survive, they were dining. They moved into the empty cottages of the dead. They combined small strips of land into large farms. The middle class was being born right there, in the mud of the post-plague field. But the biggest change wasn't the food, it was the power dynamics. Remember the landlords, the CEOs of feudalism. They were in crisis. They tried to use force. They tried to ban higher wages. But the market always wins. If a lord wanted his harvest brought in, he had to beg. He had to offer cash. He had to offer better terms. The golden handcuffs of serfdom, the system that tied a man to the land for life, were unlocked by the bacteria. The peasant was no longer property. He was a free agent. He could negotiate. This terrified the elite more than the plague itself. Chroniclers from the time, who were mostly monks and aristocrats, wrote about this with absolute disgust. One wrote, "The servants have become masters, and the masters have become servants." The world is upside down. They hated it, but they couldn't stop it. This brings us back to our title. The perfect peace. The Pax Mongolica was a peace of submission, a peace imposed from above. But the peace that followed the Black Death was different. It was a peace of negotiation. It was a gritty, uncomfortable, transactional peace. It forced Europe to innovate. Because labour was so expensive, men started looking for machines to do the work. This drive for efficiency, sparked by the lack of manpower, planted the seeds for the printing press, for improved water mills, and eventually for the Industrial Revolution. The Black Death was a forest fire. It burned down the rotting, overgrown canopy of feudalism. It cleared the dead wood. And in the ashes, it allowed something new to grow, something sharper, something more competitive, something modern. So, we have blamed the Mongols, we have blamed the fleas, we have blamed the trade routes. But now, standing at the end of the history, we have to ask the final, uncomfortable question. Was it worth it? Did 200 million people have to die so that we could be free? Let's head to the final conclusion. So, we return to where we started. We began with the Pax Mongolica, the perfect peace of the 13th century. A peace built on submission, order, and efficiency. It was a system designed to move goods, and it worked so well. It moved the apocalypse. But when the screaming finally stopped in 1353, Europe found itself in a different kind of peace. This wasn't a peace given by an emperor. It was a peace earned by survivors. The Black Death was a cruel teacher. But its lesson was absolute. Efficiency is fragile. The medieval world was a just-in-time system of feudal labour and grain. When the shock came, the system shattered. But what rose from the ashes was resilience. The survivors were tougher, they were richer, they were more sceptical. They stopped looking at the stars for answers and started looking at the human body, laying the groundwork for modern medicine. They stopped accepting the divine right of kings and started negotiating their own worth, laying the groundwork for democracy. They stopped fearing the ocean and started building better ships to conquer it, laying the groundwork for the age of exploration. It is a terrible thing to say, and historians hesitate to whisper it, but the Black Death was the great filter that Europe needed. Without the plague, there is no Renaissance. Without the collapse of serfdom, there is no industrial revolution. Without the death of the old authority, there is no enlightenment. We are the children of that slaughter. The modern world, with its middle class, its labour rights, and its scientific curiosity, was paid for by the 200 million people who suffocated in their own blood in 1348. They paid the exit fee from the Dark Ages, so that we could enter the light. But before we close the book on this chapter, we must look in the mirror, because history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. You're watching this video thanks to a global network of commerce and technology that would make the Mongol Khans weep with envy. We have rebuilt the Pax Mongolica, but we have built it bigger, faster, tighter. We have flattened the world again. We trade with everyone. We travel everywhere. A virus from a jungle bat can reach New York in 12 hours. A financial crash in Tokyo can bankrupt a family in London in 12 seconds. We have sacrificed resilience for efficiency. Again, the Genoese merchants thought they were bringing home gold. They didn't know what was hiding in the cargo hold. We too are carrying cargo. Let us hope that our perfect peace is stronger than theirs. If you enjoyed this autopsy of the medieval world, you might want to see how other empires collapse from within. Click the playlist on your screen now to explore our series on the fall of civilizations. Or, if you want to understand the economics of war, check out our deep dive on the Opium Wars. We are a small independent channel, and the YouTube algorithm is a beast almost as fickle as the bubonic plague. So please, leave a like to help the signal survive the noise. Share this video with a friend who thinks they know history, and subscribe to the Historian's Desk. From all of us here, thank you for joining us in the dark. Sleep well, and remember to check your cargo.